In 1891, a fire tore through a mansion in Ascension Parish, Louisiana. As the flames consumed the third floor, an unusual event occurred. The heat caused the floor to give way, revealing a staircase leading into darkness. When firefighters ventured down, expecting a simple root cellar, they instead discovered a labyrinth of underground rooms extending beneath the entire estate. The construction was exacting. Brick archways, ventilation shafts, and in one locked chamber they found something that made even seasoned men recoil. 17 iron examination tables, leather restraints worn thin from decades of use, and walls covered in precise handwriting, names, dates, physical descriptions, and clinical French medical notations documenting procedures no person should ever endure. The fire marshal's report labeled it a medical facility of unknown purpose, but the elderly black residents of the parish knew precisely what it was. They had heard the whispers from their mothers and grandmothers, stories about the rooms beneath Riverside Plantation, and what Madame Josephine Blanchard forced young women to suffer in the name of profit and science. What makes this discovery particularly unsettling is not just the atrocities within those rooms, but their prevalence. Between 1820 and 1865, at least 40 plantations across Louisiana operated similar facilities, underground chambers designed for one purpose, turning enslaved women's bodies into factories for producing human commodities. This wasn't the random cruelty of individual slaveholders. It was systematic, documented, and refined over decades into a business model that Louisiana's wealthiest families discussed openly at dinner parties and agricultural meetings. Before we descend into those basement rooms and confront what transpired there, I need you to grasp something. This story isn't about distant history. The last woman born in one of these breeding chambers died in 1971. Her name was Sarah Mutton, 93 years old, from Baton Rouge. She spent her entire life searching for her mother, a woman she had seen only twice before being sold away at age 8. If you're watching from Louisiana or anywhere in the South, drop a comment with your city. Your connection to this history matters. These weren't just victims, they were grandmothers, great-great-grandmothers whose bloodlines run through millions of Americans living today. And subscribe to the channel because stories like this don't just need to be told. They need to be preserved, remembered, and understood in all their terrible complexity. What happened in those basement rooms reveals something history textbooks prefer to gloss over. They teach about cotton economics and political debates over slavery's expansion, but they don't teach about the women locked underground and medically monitored to ensure their bodies yielded maximum profit. Let me take you back to 1834, Ascension Parish, Louisiana, 50 miles upriver from New Orleans along the Mississippi. The land here was among the richest in North America. Alluvial soil producing sugarcane so thick and tall it looked like a green ocean stretching to the horizon. The plantations along this river stretch were kingdoms unto themselves, thousands of acres, hundreds of enslaved people, wealth that would make modern billionaires seem modest. Riverside Plantation was established in 1803 by Etienne Blanchard, a French Creole who fled Saint-Domingue during the Haitian Revolution. He built a legendary mansion, 3 stories of imported marble and mahogany, galleries wrapping the entire structure, gardens with plants from Europe and the Caribbean. It sat on a slight rise overlooking the river, a monument to power and control. But it was Etienne's daughter, Josephine, who turned Riverside into something far more disturbing than a symbol of wealth. Josephine Blanchard was not what you'd expect from an antebellum Louisiana woman. She never married. She ran the plantation herself after her father's death in 1828, making her one of the few women in Louisiana controlling property worth over $1 million. She corresponded with physicians in Paris and Edinburgh, subscribed to medical journals, and attended lectures at the Medical College of Louisiana, sitting in the back row where women were grudgingly permitted. Her neighbors considered her eccentric but brilliant. Her enslaved population considered her the devil in silk dresses. Here's what set Josephine apart from other plantation owners. Most slaveholders in the 1830s were still buying their enslaved workforce from the domestic slave trade. Virginia and Maryland functioned as breeding grounds, supplying the Deep South with a constant stream of human beings torn from their families and sold downriver. Josephine looked at this system and saw inefficiency. Why pay premium prices for enslaved people from Virginia when you could produce your own? Why rely on traders when you could create a self-sustaining workforce that grew more valuable with each generation? She began her experiments in 1829. That's when construction started. Local builders thought they were installing expanded wine cellars beneath the main house. The project took 14 months and employed 30 skilled masons and carpenters. The result was a network of underground chambers stretching nearly 200 feet beneath the property, temperature-controlled, ventilated through cleverly disguised shafts, and completely invisible from above. You could walk across Riverside's manicured lawns with no idea that directly beneath your feet were rooms where young women were being systematically transformed into breeding stock. The first woman brought to those rooms was named Charlotte, 16 years old, born on the plantation, healthy, literate, because Josephine believed intelligence was an inheritable trait that would increase her children's value. Charlotte had grown up thinking she might work in the house, perhaps secure a relatively safe position in the plantation hierarchy. Instead, on a spring morning in 1830, she was summoned to the main house. Josephine herself met her, not unkindly. That was the thing about Josephine. She wasn't screaming or violent. She was calm, clinical. She explained that Charlotte had been selected for an important role. Better food, better clothing, better quarters than field workers, and children trained for skilled positions who would never know the brutality of the cane fields. All Charlotte had to do was cooperate with certain procedures. Then Josephine led her down a staircase hidden behind a panel in the main house library, down into a corridor lit by oil lamps, into rooms smelling of disinfectant and something else Charlotte couldn't identify. Fear, perhaps, or despair so thick it had soaked into the brick walls. The first room Charlotte entered was approximately 20 feet square, with a low ceiling supported by brick arches that gave it the feel of a crypt. Along one wall stood glass-fronted cabinets holding medical instruments, speculums, forceps, devices Charlotte had never seen before. In the center sat a table unlike anything she'd encountered, a padded leather surface, stirrups at one end, leather straps at precise intervals. Beside it stood Dr. Armand Devereux, 56 years old, a graduate of the Medical College of Louisiana, a man who had spent 30 years as a physician to New Orleans' wealthiest families and who was about to examine Charlotte's body with the same detached professionalism he might apply to inspecting a horse. What happened over the next 2 hours destroyed something fundamental in Charlotte. Not just her bodily autonomy, though that was certainly violated, but her understanding of what human beings were capable of doing to each other while maintaining perfect civility. Dr. Devereux spoke throughout the examination, explaining procedures to Josephine, noting observations in a leather-bound journal, commenting on Charlotte's physical characteristics, as if she weren't a person lying terrified on that table, but a specimen to be catalogued. Excellent pelvic structure, he noted. Bone density suggests strong constitution, no obvious defects. I would estimate reproductive capacity at 8 to 10 live births, assuming standard intervals and adequate nutritional support. Josephine stood nearby, watching, making her own notes, asking questions about optimal timing for conception, dietary requirements during pregnancy, methods for increasing the likelihood of multiple births. They discussed Charlotte's future as if she were a crop they were planning, as if her body was simply a resource to be managed for maximum yield. When it was over, Charlotte was led to another room, smaller, 8 by 10 feet, with a narrow bed, a chamber pot, and a small table holding a Bible. This would be her home for the foreseeable future. The door closed, the lock clicked, and Charlotte understood that her life as she had known it was over. She was the first, but she wouldn't be the last. Over the next 3 years, Josephine expanded her program systematically. She selected 12 young women from Riverside's enslaved population, all between 15 and 22, all healthy, all possessing characteristics Josephine believed would produce valuable children. intelligence, physical strength, and specific appearances that would command premium prices in urban slave markets. The underground complex grew to accommodate them. Individual cells, a common room for supervised needlework, a kitchen preparing specialized diets rich in protein and calcium, a nursery for infants, and at the center, the medical chambers where Dr. Devereux conducted his examinations and procedures. But Josephine's innovation went beyond forcing women to bear children. Other plantation owners did that. What made Riverside's program unique was its systematic documentation and deliberate genetic management. Josephine kept journals that read like agricultural breeding records. She tracked bloodlines across generations, documented which pairings produced children with desired traits, and experimented with combinations to breed enslaved people the way others bred horses or cattle. She maintained meticulous records of every woman's menstrual cycles. Dr. Devereux examined them weekly, timing their assignments to what he believed were optimal fertility windows. The men selected were chosen based on Josephine's breeding charts. Height, strength, complexion, skills, even temperament considered inheritable. The men had no more choice than the women. Refuse and you'd be sold to the sugar mills downriver, where life expectancy for field workers was measured in years. Cooperate and you'd receive better rations, lighter work assignments. You'd become complicit in the system destroying others' humanity, but you'd survive. And that was the genius of Josephine's system. She didn't need overseers with whips. She built a structure where survival required cooperation, where the threat of something worse made people participate in their own oppression. Let me tell you about Rachel. She was brought to the basement rooms in 1832, 17 years old, purchased at auction in New Orleans specifically for Josephine's program. The bill of sale described her as healthy, intelligent, suitable for domestic service or breeding. That last word, breeding, written right there in legal documents as if Rachel were livestock. Rachel's introduction followed the same pattern as Charlotte's. The examination, the clinical discussion of her reproductive potential, the small cell that became her prison. But Rachel had something Charlotte lacked: rage. During her first week underground, she refused to eat, screamed at Dr. Devereux during examinations, tore at leather restraints until her wrists bled, and made it clear she would rather die than cooperate. Josephine's response revealed the calculated cruelty beneath her civilized exterior. She didn't beat Rachel or starve her. Instead, she brought another woman to Rachel's cell. Mary, 8 months pregnant, part of the program from its beginning, and explained calmly that Rachel's cooperation would determine Mary's fate. Continued resistance meant Mary would be sold immediately after giving birth to a particularly brutal plantation owner in Point Coupee Parish, her baby sold separately, with Mary dying in the cane fields within a year and her child growing up never knowing a mother's love. But if Rachel cooperated, Mary would remain at Riverside, allowed to nurse her baby and see that child grow up. It was a choice that wasn't a choice. Rachel understood that Josephine would make good on the threat. So she stopped screaming, stopped refusing food, stopped resisting. She learned what all the women learned. Survival required psychological splitting. You separated your mind from your body, went somewhere else during examinations, forced encounters, and pregnancies you couldn't prevent. You built walls inside your head to protect whatever small piece of yourself you could keep sacred. The women developed their own language down there. Coded phrases to communicate under supervision, strategies for emotional survival, stories about lives lived before and dreams still held despite everything. They became a community forged in shared trauma, mothers who would never raise their children, women whose bodies had become battlegrounds in an economic war they hadn't chosen. Above them, Riverside Plantation continued its facade of genteel Southern civilization. Josephine hosted dinners, attended church, and made charitable donations to the Catholic orphanage in Donaldsonville. She was respected, admired even, a woman who had taken control of her inheritance and managed it with remarkable efficiency. No one talked about the rooms beneath her house, or if they knew, they didn't care. Because in 1834 Louisiana, what Josephine was doing was perfectly legal. Enslaved people were property, And what you did with your property was your business. By 1836, Riverside's underground facility housed 23 women. The oldest was 34, the youngest just turned 15. Together, they had produced 41 children in 6 years. Of those, 17 had been sold by age 10, 12 remained at Riverside being trained for skilled positions, and the rest died in infancy or early childhood, buried in an unmarked section of the Plantation cemetery. Josephine documented every birth, death, and sale with ledger-like precision. Her journals, discovered after the 1891 fire, reveal a mind that had completely divorced morality from methodology. She wrote about enslaved women's pregnancies the way a modern factory documents production yields, noting output efficiency, calculating return on investment, and comparing profitability to cotton and sugar cultivation. One entry from March 1836 is particularly chilling. Charlotte delivered her 4th child today. Male, excellent proportions, light complexion, will command premium price in New Orleans market by age 12. Total production from Charlotte, 4 live births, 3 surviving to age 5. Projected combined value $3,400. Initial acquisition cost, 0. Plantation born, current age 22. Estimated remaining productive years, 8 to 10. Projected lifetime value, $7,000, $8,000. This represents superior return compared to cotton production from equivalent land acreage. Charlotte, the first woman brought to those rooms, had become a line item in a profit calculation. Her body was measured in dollars and projected yields. Her children were inventory. But what Josephine's clinical journals couldn't capture was what was happening in the minds of the women trapped in her system, the psychological warfare they waged to maintain their sanity. The small acts of resistance that never made it into official records. Let me tell you about what they called the forgetting ritual. The women created it together in whispered conversations during brief supervision lapses. When a child was sold away, the mother would gather with the others in the common room, sit in a circle, and tell stories about the child, every detail they could remember. The sound of the baby's first cry, the way the child smiled, favorite foods, small jokes, personality quirks. They'd tell these stories repeatedly for 3 days, memorizing every detail, burning it into their minds. Then, on the 4th day, they'd perform the forgetting ritual. The mother would stand in the center and speak directly to her absent child, expressing all her love, her wishes she could have protected them, her hopes they'd survive. She'd pour out her heart completely, holding nothing back. Then the others would help her lock it away, reminding her that to survive, she needed to separate love from daily reality, to keep her child in a sacred mental place but not let grief destroy her ability to function. Because if she broke down completely, Josephine would consider her unproductive and sell her to the worst Louisiana plantations. It was brutal pragmatism born of absolute powerlessness. They saved each other by teaching each other how to survive emotional devastation that should have been unsurvivable. Rachel, who had initially resisted so fiercely, became one of the strongest practitioners of this survival technique. By 1838, she'd given birth to 3 children, 2 sold, and a third, a daughter named Grace, remaining in Riverside's nursery. Rachel learned to work within the system while secretly maintaining defiance. She cooperated during examinations, followed dietary regimens, participated in pairings, but inside she never stopped fighting. She began memorizing breeding records during needlework hours, observing when Josephine updated journals, catching glimpses of names, dates, sales prices. She committed everything to memory, building a mental archive of what was happening. Rachel didn't have a plan for what she'd do with this information. There was no legal recourse, no authority to intervene on behalf of enslaved women. But some instinct told her documentation mattered, that if these crimes were ever to be acknowledged, someone needed to preserve the truth. Other women noticed her careful attention and began contributing their own pieces. One remembered a child's buyer, another recalled a birth date. Together, they created a collective memory paralleling Josephine's documentation. They called it the true accounting, and it would become crucial evidence decades later. But in 1838, survival was measured in days, not decades, in small victories, not grand resistance. In maintaining enough humanity to love your children even when you knew you'd lose them. in finding ways to be kind to each other in a place designed to strip away every human connection. Dr. Devereux visited the underground complex every Tuesday and Friday. His examinations were thorough and humiliating, treating women's bodies as machines to be maintained and optimized. When pregnancies occurred, he monitored with obsessive attention. Weight gain, fetal positioning, signs of complications. His interest wasn't humanitarian. Josephine paid him a bonus for every healthy birth and penalized him financially when women died in childbirth or babies were stillborn. This created a perverse incentive where Dr. Devereux actually provided better medical care than enslaved women typically received, not because he cared, but because their survival affected his income. The delivery room was remarkably advanced for the 1830s. Clean linens, sterilized instruments, chloroform for pain management during difficult deliveries, techniques learned from European medical journals, and careful tracking of maternal mortality and infant survival. Riverside's maternal mortality rate was actually lower than the Louisiana state average. Josephine noted this with pride in letters to other plantation owners. The key, she wrote, is maintaining assets in good condition. A dead mother represents significant capital loss. Dr. Devereux understands his primary responsibility is preserving my investment. The women's emotional states were irrelevant, but their physical health directly impacted profitability. This calculation allowed Josephine to provide relatively good medical care while denying every human right. The women weren't people deserving of health. They were investments requiring maintenance. In 1839, Josephine expanded her program again, purchasing 8 young women at the New Orleans slave market, specifically selecting for characteristics she believed would produce high-value children: intelligence, physical beauty, and light skin that commanded premium prices in urban markets where enslaved people worked as domestic servants or skilled artisans. One was Pauline, 18 years old, raised as a house servant in a New Orleans merchant's home. She could read and write in French and English, play piano, and present herself with refined manners. When the merchant died and his estate was liquidated, Josephine paid $1, $200 for her, an enormous sum reflecting Pauline's skills and appearance. Pauline's introduction to Riverside's underground rooms shattered the remnants of her relatively sheltered life. She had experienced slavery's cruelty and injustice in New Orleans, understood she was property with no legal rights, that her life could be upended at any moment. But nothing had prepared her for the systematic, medicalized exploitation awaiting her beneath Josephine's mansion. The first time Dr. Devereux examined her, Pauline tried to maintain dignity through formal manners, answering politely, enduring with the composed facade she'd used at her former master's dinner parties, but there was no maintaining dignity in that examination room. Dr. Devereux's procedures were degrading, the positions he required, the instruments he used, the clinical commentary he provided to Josephine, while Pauline lay restrained on that leather table. When it was over, Pauline was led to her cell, and for the first time, she understood that there were forms of violation that couldn't be endured with good manners and composed silence. She sat on the narrow bed and felt something fundamental break inside her. Rachel found her several hours later. By 1839, Rachel had achieved a strange status in the underground community. She'd survived longer than most, learned to navigate Josephine's system, and become someone newer women looked to for guidance. She sat beside Pauline and didn't offer false comfort or pretend things would get better. Instead, she told the truth. This is going to destroy parts of you that you didn't know could be destroyed. You're going to lose pieces of yourself that you thought were permanent. Your body is going to be used in ways that will make you want to die, and you might want to die. Most of us do at some point. Pauline looked at her, tears streaming. Then why are you telling me this? Why not let me have whatever hope I can hold on to? Rachel's voice was steady because false hope is worse than no hope. False hope means you think if you just endure this examination or this pregnancy or this separation from a child, things will improve. But they won't. This is your life now. So you need to learn how to survive it without hope. How do you survive without hope? You survive for the small things. For moments when you make another woman laugh. For the feeling of a baby moving inside you before you have to give them up. For the satisfaction of memorizing one more detail that Josephine would prefer to keep hidden. You survive not because you believe things will get better, but because surviving becomes its own purpose. Because every day you stay alive is a day you who haven't let them completely destroy you. This conversation, recreated from testimony Pauline gave 60 years later, reveals the psychological strategies these women developed. They didn't delude themselves with optimism. They faced reality with brutal honesty and survived by finding meaning in resistance so small it was almost invisible. The underground community developed its own culture, songs whispered during lax supervision, spirituals with lyrics taking on new meaning in their circumstances. Songs about deliverance that once meant salvation in the next life now meant freedom in this one. Songs about rivers that once symbolized religious baptism now meant the Mississippi and escape north. They told stories, memories of lives before Riverside, carefully preserved to hold on to the knowledge that they had once been more than this. Fantasies about the future, about children who might find each other years after being sold apart. About justice that might someday come even if they didn't live to see it. And they practiced small rebellions Josephine never detected, deliberately mishearing instructions, working slowly when they could, accidentally ruining expensive fabric during sewing projects. These acts didn't change their circumstances, but they provided psychological victories that sustained them. Josephine's breeding program expanded steadily through the early 1840s. By 1843, the underground complex housed 31 women, the nursery held 19 children under 6, and another 23 children born in the program were old enough to work, distributed throughout Riverside's operations or sold to other plantations. The financial returns were exactly what Josephine had calculated. Between 1830 and 1843, the breeding program generated over $89,000 in documented revenue from child sales, plus the increased value of Riverside's self-sustaining labor force. By comparison, sugar operations generated approximately $45. Annually during the same period. Josephine's success attracted attention. Other plantation owners visited to study her methods. She gave tours of the underground facility to select peers, explaining her breeding theories, sharing documentation techniques and discussing optimal pairing strategies over dinner. While directly beneath the dining room, women sat in their cells preparing for forced pregnancies. At least 6 other Louisiana plantations implemented similar programs based on Josephine's model, spreading to Mississippi and Alabama, a network of slaveholders who saw human reproduction as their most profitable enterprise. Corresponding and sharing data, they discussed it in terms of agricultural improvement and scientific management, population enhancement, bloodline management, natural increase optimization. But what they were actually doing was systematically raping women and selling their children. No amount of clinical terminology could disguise that fundamental truth. In 1844, something happened that revealed the limits of even Josephine's carefully constructed system. A woman named Marie, part of the breeding program since 1837, became pregnant for the 6th time. The pregnancy proceeded normally through 7 months, with regular examinations detecting no complications. Then Marie went into premature labor. After 19 hours, she gave birth to a stillborn infant and began hemorrhaging. Dr. Devereux worked desperately to stop the bleeding, employing every technique he knew, but sometimes the human body fails. Marie died on that delivery table 48 hours after labor began. She was 27 years old. Her death represented a significant financial loss for Josephine. Marie had produced 5 surviving children, generating over $4,000 in revenue, with potentially 8 to 10 more productive years. Josephine calculated the loss at approximately $6,000 in unrealized future value. But for the women in the underground community, Marie's death meant something entirely different. She was one of them, someone who had endured the same violations, shared the same small rebellions, participated in the same survival rituals. Her death reminded them that their bodies could only endure so much, that pregnancy and childbirth, even with medical attention, carried risks multiplying with each successive birth. Rachel organized the mourning ritual. The women gathered in the common room, told stories about Marie remembering her laugh, the way she sang lullabies to nursery babies, her embroidery skill, the time she'd deliberately sewn an obscene French phrase into the hem of a dress Josephine wore to church, a rebellion so small and hidden that only the women who knew ever appreciated it. They mourned her not just as a friend, but as a casualty of a war they were fighting against impossible odds. And they added her name to the true accounting. Josephine's response was entirely practical. She purchased a replacement at the next New Orleans slave auction, a woman named Sophie, 19 years old, healthy, ready to be incorporated into the program. The system continued without pause because individual deaths didn't matter to Josephine. She was managing populations, not people. One woman could be replaced with another. The machinery of human reproduction she had built just kept operating. But something shifted in the underground community after Marie's death. The women began talking more openly about resistance, not dramatic escape attempts or violent rebellion, but systematic resistance through documentation and preservation of truth. Rachel's project of memorizing breeding records became more organized, with multiple women participating, each responsible for remembering different aspects: names of children sold, buyers, dates, prices, physical descriptions that might help trace bloodlines decades later. They didn't know why they were doing this. They had no realistic hope that the information would ever be used to reunite families or bring justice. But the act of documenting, of refusing to let their experiences disappear into Josephine's sanitized ledgers, became its own form of resistance. In 1846, a priest named Father Gabriel Rousseau began visiting Riverside Plantation quarterly to provide religious instruction. He was a young man recently ordained, genuinely devoted to his faith, and deeply troubled by slavery's moral implications. When Josephine showed him the underground complex, explaining that these women needed spiritual guidance as they fulfilled their duties to the plantation, Father Rousseau was horrified. He recognized immediately that he was seeing systematic sexual exploitation disguised as agricultural management. He confronted Josephine directly. "Madame Blanchard, what you are doing here violates every principle of human dignity and Christian morality. These women are not livestock. They are human souls created in God's image." Josephine's response was calm and devastating in its logic. "Father, I respect your spiritual authority, but surely you understand that the church has not condemned slavery itself. These are my property under Louisiana law. I am managing my property responsibly, providing excellent medical care and ensuring these women and their children are well fed and healthy. What would you have me do? Release them to poverty and starvation? Abandon my responsibilities as a property owner?" Father Rousseau tried to argue theology and morality. Josephine countered with law and economics. The conversation ended in stalemate. The priest continued his quarterly visits, providing what spiritual comfort he could to the women, but taking no action that would actually disrupt Josephine's operations. This accommodation, this willingness to witness atrocity without intervening meaningfully, would haunt Father Rousseau for the rest of his life. In 1878, as an elderly man, he gave testimony about what he'd seen, describing his own moral failure with painful honesty. "I told myself I was helping by bringing them the sacraments. But the truth is, I was too cowardly to do what Christian morality demanded. I should have exposed what was happening, used whatever influence I had to stop it. Instead, I gave Madame Blanchard the veneer of religious approval by continuing to visit. I baptized children who would be sold away from their mothers. I heard confessions from women who had nothing to confess except the crime of surviving, and I did nothing to actually challenge the system. I will answer for that cowardice when I face God's judgment." But in 1846, Father Rousseau simply continued his visits, becoming another fixture in the underground rooms. The women appreciated his kindness, but they understood that kindness without action was just another form of complicity. By 1850, Riverside's breeding program had been operating for 21 years. The underground complex had produced 127, 73 sold, generating documented revenue of $67,400. With the remaining working throughout Riverside's operations, or still too young. But something was changing in the world above ground. Political tensions over slavery's expansion were intensifying. California's admission as a free state shifted congressional balance. The Fugitive Slave Act inflamed northern opposition, and in Louisiana itself, enslaved people began hearing whispers of a growing movement questioning whether human beings should be property at all. These national debates barely touched Riverside's underground rooms. The women trapped there had no access to newspapers or political discussions, but they sensed something shifting. Father Rousseau would mention tensions in Washington or conflicts between North and South. House servants bringing food would whisper fragments of overheard conversations. Hope is a dangerous thing for people in impossible situations. It can sustain you or destroy you when it proves false. The women in Riverside's basement learned to hold hope carefully, like a candle flame you protect from the wind but don't dare hold too close. Pauline, who had arrived in 1839, had by 1850 given birth to 4 children. 3 had been sold. 1, a son named Marcus, remained at Riverside, 9 years old, being trained as a carpenter. Pauline saw him perhaps once a month during Father Rousseau's visits, when children were brought down for religious instruction. Marcus didn't call her mother. He'd been taught to call her Pauline, to understand that his real family was Riverside Plantation, that his loyalty belonged to Madame Blanchard. But during those brief visits, Pauline would find ways to touch his hand, to speak in coded language, telling him fairy tales that contained information about his heritage. A princess in a hidden kingdom beneath the earth, her own mother, whom she'd never see again, a brave knight who traveled far to a magical city by the sea, his father Joseph, sold to Mobile 3 years earlier, might still be alive. These stories were Pauline's way of giving Marcus something Josephine couldn't take away. A sense of connection to people who loved him, a hidden history contradicting the narrative of property and ownership. Other women did the same with their children during those brief supervised visits, embedding truth in fiction, creating memory in spaces between words, ensuring that even if children couldn't understand it at the time, some part of them would carry forward the knowledge that they came from people who had loved them despite impossible circumstances. In 1852, Josephine began a new phase, documenting third-generation births, children whose mothers had themselves been born in the breeding program, now old enough to be incorporated. This represented the full realization of her vision, a completely self-sustaining population, where every individual had been literally bred for specific characteristics, where genetic lineage could be traced through carefully maintained records, where human beings were cultivated like prize roses. Charlotte's daughter Desiree turned 15 in 1852. She had been born in the underground complex, had never known any life except Riverside, had grown up watching her mother and other women go through pregnancy after pregnancy, and understood exactly what awaited her. The day Desiree was brought for her first medical assessment, Charlotte had to watch. Josephine required it, wanting the older women to witness the next generation's incorporation, to understand that the cycle was permanent and inevitable. Charlotte stood in that room and watched Dr. Devereux, now 70, assess her daughter with the same clinical detachment he'd once used on her. She watched Josephine make notes, calculating which man should be paired with Desiree for optimal offspring, and something broke in Charlotte that had survived 22 years of systematic exploitation. She had endured her own violations, given birth to 6 children, and watched 5 sold away, learned every survival technique, but watching her daughter enter the same hell shattered whatever psychological armor she'd built. That night, Charlotte tried to hang herself using strips of fabric torn from her dress. Rachel found her before she died, cut her down, revived her. The other women gathered around as Charlotte sobbed, not with the careful control they'd all learned, but with complete abandonment. "I can't watch her go through this," Charlotte said. "I can't watch Desiree become what I became. I thought if I survived, if I cooperated, my children might somehow escape this. But they're never going to escape. This is going to continue forever. We're breeding our own children into slavery within slavery." The women had no comfort to offer because Charlotte was right. The system was designed to be permanent. Josephine had created something that could reproduce itself infinitely. As long as slavery remained legal, As long as Riverside existed, women would be locked in these rooms and forced to produce children who would grow up to produce more. Generation after generation, Rachel sat with Charlotte through that night. She didn't try to convince her to hope or offer false reassurance. Instead, she reminded Charlotte of something fundamental. "We document," Rachel said. "We remember. We make sure what's happening here doesn't disappear into Josephine's sanitized records. Maybe we'll never see justice. Maybe Desiree and her children and her children's children will all suffer the same way we have. But someday, someone needs to know the truth, and we're the only ones who can preserve it." This became the women's purpose, not survival for its own sake, but survival as an act of historical witness. They maintained the true accounting with even greater dedication, taught younger women, including Desiree, to memorize names, dates, and details, and created a collective memory paralleling and contradicting Josephine's official documentation. They couldn't change their present circumstances, but they could ensure the future would know what had happened in these underground rooms. In 1854, Dr. Devereux died at age 72. His death represented a significant challenge for Josephine. Finding another physician willing to conduct examinations and attend births for enslaved women in a breeding program wasn't simple. Many doctors, while comfortable with slavery in general, were uncomfortable with the explicitly sexual nature of the work. Josephine eventually hired Dr. Etienne Lafont, a younger physician who had studied in Paris and returned to Louisiana with significant debts and few patients. He needed money more than moral consistency. The examinations continued. The pregnancies continued. The system adapted to new management without fundamentally changing. Dr. Lafont was, if anything, more ruthless than his predecessor. Dr. Devereux had maintained clinical detachment. Lafont seemed to take satisfaction in his power over the women. His examinations were more invasive than necessary, his commentary more degrading. He represented a new generation of medical professionals trained in an era where scientific racism was becoming academically respectable. He brought theories about racial characteristics and heredity gaining currency in medical schools. Measured the women's skulls, and documented their physical features according to elaborate classification systems, treating them not just as breeding stock, but as subjects for scientific inquiry into what he believed were fundamental racial differences. The women hated Dr. Lafont in ways they had never quite hated Dr. Devereux. The older doctor had at least treated them with indifferent professionalism. Lafont treated them with active contempt, as if their suffering confirmed his theories about racial inferiority. But even this cruelty became something the women added to their documentation. They memorized Lafont's exact words, noted his procedures, preserved evidence of a system becoming, if anything, more brutally efficient in the 1850s as scientific racism provided new justifications for old exploitation. By 1857, the underground complex housed 38 women ranging from 15 to 40. 14 of them, including Desiree, were second generation, born in the breeding program itself. The nursery held 23 children under 6. And throughout Riverside's operations worked another 42 individuals born in the basement and raised to serve the plantation's needs. Josephine was now 63, having spent nearly 30 years perfecting her system. She had accumulated wealth, making her one of the richest women in Louisiana, all while maintaining a reputation as a genteel, educated, pious plantation owner who attended Mass regularly and made generous donations to the church. The cognitive dissonance was breathtaking. Josephine could spend mornings reviewing breeding records, documented systematic sexual exploitation, then afternoons hosting tea parties, discussing literature and music with neighboring plantation mistresses. She could calculate financial returns on forced pregnancies, then kneel in prayer at Sunday Mass. This capacity for compartmentalization wasn't unique to Josephine. It characterized the entire slaveholding class, who built elaborate justifications allowing them to commit atrocities while maintaining self-images as civilized, Christian, honorable people. But by the late 1850s, that system of justifications was beginning to crack. The national political crisis over slavery intensified. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 sent shockwaves through the South. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 triggered secession. Louisiana left the Union in January 1861. The Civil War's outbreak initially seemed distant from Riverside, but slowly it began to disrupt even the carefully controlled underground environment. Young white men enlisted in Confederate regiments. Riverside's overseer left. Josephine struggled to find reliable supervisors. The price of luxury goods skyrocketed. Even medical supplies became scarce. More significantly, enslaved people throughout the South heard about Union armies, contraband camps where fugitives found protection, the possibility that the war might end slavery entirely. Hope, that dangerous thing, began circulating through the underground community with new intensity. The women whispered to each other about what they'd heard from field workers. Union gunboats on the Mississippi, plantations closer to New Orleans where enslaved people fled to Union lines. Rachel, now in her 40s and beyond childbearing age but retained for sewing skills and supervisory role, tried to temper this hope with realism. Even if the North wins, even if slavery ends, we need to be careful. Freedom won't mean justice. We might get out of these rooms, but we'll still be black women in Louisiana. We'll still be vulnerable. We need to plan for what comes after, not just dream about it. This pragmatic approach to potential liberation revealed the psychological scars the women carried. They had learned not to trust promises. They had survived by expecting the worst. Even the possibility of freedom carried risks they needed to prepare for. In 1862, New Orleans fell to Union forces. Federal troops occupied the city and Union authority extended up the Mississippi, getting closer to Ascension Parish. Josephine, like other plantation owners in the region, faced a difficult calculation. Should she remain at Riverside, trying to maintain control, or evacuate inland, taking her most valuable property with her? She chose to stay. Riverside was too valuable to abandon, and she believed that even if Union forces occupied the parish, they wouldn't interfere with property rights. Slavery might be contested nationally, but surely individual property ownership would be respected. This calculation revealed how completely Josephine had internalized the idea that enslaved people were property first and people second. Even with Union armies approaching, she worried more about losing her financial investment than about the moral reckoning that might come. The women in the underground complex heard about New Orleans' fall and Union troops, and they began discussing something they'd never seriously considered. The possibility of survival beyond Riverside. They had spent years, some decades, in those rooms, born children in that basement, been examined and violated and forced to participate in a system designed to strip away their humanity. But they had never truly believed they would live to see an end to it. Now for the first time, they began to imagine freedom. Not as a distant abstraction or spiritual promise, but as a concrete possibility arriving with Union soldiers. Pauline, who had been at Riverside since 1839, began teaching literacy to younger women. Officially, she was instructing them in needlework, but hidden in sewing patterns were letters and numbers. She taught them to read and write in stolen moments, preparing for a freedom that might require documentation and bureaucratic navigation. This was the women's way. Even imprisoned, even exploited, they prepared for survival beyond their current circumstances. They refused to be defined entirely by victimization. They maintained skills, knowledge, and relationships that might become resources if the world ever changed enough to matter. In August 1862, Union troops arrived in Ascension Parish, establishing a military garrison in Donaldsonville. Federal authority now extended to the region around Riverside. But the women's liberation didn't come immediately. The Union Army's policy towards slavery in occupied Louisiana was contradictory and evolving. Some officers returned fugitive slaves to plantations, treating slavery as a property issue. Others established contraband camps. Still others ignored the question entirely. Josephine, showing remarkable adaptability, presented herself to Union officers as a loyal woman who had always opposed secession, emphasizing her French heritage and noting that France had abolished slavery, conveniently failing to mention her breeding program of over 30 years. The Union officers who visited Riverside saw a well-maintained plantation with healthy-looking enslaved people, had no reason to investigate. And Josephine had always been careful to keep the breeding program secret from outsiders. So the women remained trapped. Union forces occupied the parish. Federal authority theoretically extended to Riverside. But nothing changed in the underground rooms. The examinations continued. The pregnancies continued. Dr. Lefont still visited twice weekly. Josephine still maintained her breeding records. The proximity of potential freedom made captivity even more unbearable. The women could hear Union troops passing on the river road, could imagine walking out into a world where they might be recognized as human beings rather than property. But they remained locked in darkness. This is when Charlotte made her decision. She was 44 years old, had been in the breeding program since 1830, 32 years, had given birth to 9 children, 7 sold. Her daughter Desiree was now part of the same system. Her granddaughter, Desiree's child, had just been born in the same basement where Charlotte had spent most of her adult life. 3 generations of her bloodline had been produced in those rooms, and Charlotte decided she was done cooperating. During Dr. Lefont's next examination, Charlotte refused to comply. When he ordered her onto the table, she said no. When he threatened punishment, she said she didn't care. When he tried to force her, she fought back with strength born of 3 decades of suppressed rage. Lefont called for help. The house servant supervising the complex restrained Charlotte, but she kept screaming, not in fear or pain, but defiant rage. I am not your animal. I am not your property. I am a human being, and I will not cooperate anymore. Do whatever you want to me, but I'm done pretending this is anything other than rape. I'm done acting like this system is normal. Her screams echoed through the underground chambers. Every woman heard her, and something fundamental shifted in that moment. For 32 years, survival had required cooperation, silence, the appearance of consent to a system that allowed no actual choice. But Charlotte's screams broke that enforced silence. She said out loud what they'd all known but never been allowed to speak. Josephine was summoned. She came down to find Charlotte restrained but still screaming. The other women gathered in the corridor outside. For the first time in the program's history, Josephine faced potential collective resistance. She made a quick calculation. Charlotte was past childbearing age, useful only for sewing work, now a liability disrupting the careful control that kept the system functioning, and with Union troops in the parish. Josephine needed to maintain the appearance that Riverside's enslaved people were content. She ordered Charlotte removed from the breeding complex and placed in fieldwork. Meant as punishment, but actually liberation. Charlotte spent her first night in the quarters above ground, sleeping in a cabin with other field workers, seeing stars for the first time in over 3 decades. The women remaining in the underground complex understood Charlotte's rebellion as a message. Cooperation wasn't required forever. Resistance was possible, even at great cost. The system that had seemed permanent might actually be vulnerable. They began planning more carefully, not dramatic escape attempts, but systematic preparation for the chaos they sensed was coming. They memorized information about where children had been sold, details that might help reunite families after liberation. They taught each other skills valuable in freedom. They prepared for survival beyond Riverside. By late 1864, Confederate authority in Louisiana had collapsed in most of the state. The Union Army controlled New Orleans and the Mississippi. Ascension Parish was nominally under federal occupation, though isolated plantations like Riverside still operated with minimal direct supervision. In January 1865, as Sherman's army marched through the South and Confederate defeat became inevitable, Josephine made one final calculation. She began destroying records, the breeding journals, medical documentation, charts tracking 3 generations of genetic manipulation, burning them page by page, eliminating evidence of what she'd created. But she couldn't destroy the women's memories or the true accounting they had maintained collectively. The names, dates, sales prices committed to memory, the stories preserved, the testimony they were ready to give. The end came suddenly. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. By late April, news had reached even isolated Louisiana plantations that the Confederacy no longer existed. Enslaved people throughout the South were hearing the word that would change everything: freedom. At Riverside, the news arrived on April 23, 1865, carried by a Union officer and 2 soldiers who rode up the main drive. They had orders to register formerly enslaved people, ensure they understood their new legal status, and document plantation conditions for the Freedmen's Bureau. Josephine met them on the mansion's front gallery with perfect composure. She explained that her enslaved people had always been well treated, that she had no objection to their freedom, and that she would cooperate fully with federal authorities. She was charming, civilized. She offered refreshment and answered questions with careful precision. She did not mention the underground complex beneath her feet or the breeding program she had operated for 35 years, and the Union officers, overwhelmed with registering thousands of formerly enslaved people across the parish, didn't investigate beyond what they could see on the surface. But Charlotte, working in the field since her expulsion from the underground complex, approached the officers. She was skeletal thin, worn down by decades of forced pregnancies and recent hard field labor, but her voice was steady. "Sir, there's something you need to see. Something Madame Blanchard won't tell you about." The officers followed Charlotte behind the main house to the concealed entrance, down the brick stairs into the underground chambers, where 34 women still lived, most pregnant or recovering from recent births. The officers' shock was documented in their official report filed with the Freedmen's Bureau 3 days later. "We discovered extensive underground facilities housing colored women in conditions suggesting systematic forced breeding operations. The women report being confined to these chambers for periods ranging from months to decades. Several women displayed evidence of multiple pregnancies. Medical equipment and examination facilities suggest organized program of reproduction management. Madame Blanchard claims the facilities were used only for medical care and protection, but testimony from the women contradicts this assertion. The women were brought out on April 24, 1865. Some hadn't seen sunlight in years. Rachel, part of the program since 1832, was 47 years old, had spent 33 years in those rooms, 1/3 of a century underground. When she emerged into daylight, the sun was so bright it hurt her eyes. She stood on grass for the first time in decades, feeling soil beneath her feet instead of limestone floors, and she wept not with joy exactly. The trauma of what she'd endured couldn't be erased by liberation, but with relief. The overwhelming sensation of breathing air that wasn't filtered through underground ventilation shafts. Pauline emerged with her son Marcus, now 14. She had been at Riverside since 1839. 26 years, 24 spent underground. Had given birth to 7 children, 4 sold, 3 remained at Riverside, including Marcus. The reunion wasn't the joyous embrace you might imagine. The children had been raised to see her as Pauline, not Mother. Taught that family bonds were irrelevant, that loyalty belonged to the plantation. Rebuilding those relationships would take years, and for some families it would never fully happen. Desiree, Charlotte's daughter, emerged carrying her infant daughter. 3 generations of one family, all born in the same underground complex, all products of Josephine's systematic breeding program. Charlotte held her granddaughter for the first time in daylight, trying to comprehend that this baby would not grow up in those rooms, would not be examined by doctors, would not be paired with men selected from breeding charts. The cycle that had seemed permanent and eternal had finally broken. But liberation didn't mean justice. The Union officers documented what they'd found, but no charges were filed against Josephine. What she had done was horrifying, but hadn't been illegal under Louisiana law during slavery. The breeding program, underground chambers, systematic exploitation, all within a slaveholder's legal rights to manage property. Josephine faced no punishment. She lost her enslaved workforce, a significant financial loss, but retained ownership of Riverside, continued living in the mansion, attending Mass, maintaining her parish society position. The women received their freedom and nothing else. No compensation, no assistance finding children sold. No medical care for bodies damaged by forced pregnancies, no psychological support for trauma that would pursue them for life. This is what freedom meant in 1865 Louisiana. Not justice, not restitution. Just the technical legal status of no longer being property. The Freedmen's Bureau established a camp near Donaldsonville where formerly enslaved people could receive temporary shelter and assistance. Many from Riverside went there, including most of the breeding program women. They needed help finding housing, locating family members, navigating a legal system that now recognized them as human beings, but provided little practical support. Rachel spent her first weeks of freedom giving testimony to Freedmen's Bureau agents. She told them everything. The 33 years underground, forced pregnancies, children sold, systematic nature of Josephine's breeding program. Medical examinations, the documentation she and other women had memorized. But the agents, overwhelmed with managing the transition across the South, treated her testimony as just another account of slavery's general brutality, documenting that families had been separated, women forced to bear children, conditions harsh, but not capturing the systematic, multi-generational, scientifically managed nature of what had occurred at Riverside. Rachel persisted. She began writing down the true accounting she and the other women had preserved in memory, filling notebooks with names, dates, sales records, physical descriptions, documenting everything Josephine had tried to destroy by burning her breeding journals. This written record, discovered decades later in a trunk in Rachel's granddaughter's attic, would become crucial evidence for historians trying to understand the full scope of breeding programs in antebellum Louisiana. Charlotte spent her freedom years searching for her children. She placed advertisements, wrote letters to Freedmen's Bureau offices across the South, traveled when she could afford it, following leads that might reunite her with the 7 children sold away. She found 3, her oldest son Thomas in New Orleans working as a carpenter. Her daughter Sarah had been sold to a Mississippi plantation and died there in 1859 during childbirth. Another son, James, escaped to Union lines, enlisted in the United States Colored Troops, survived the war and was farming in Arkansas. The other 4 she never located, existing only in Josephine's burned breeding records, their ultimate fates disappearing into the chaos of slavery and war. Charlotte searched until her death in 1883, never giving up hope. This became the pattern for most women freed from Riverside's underground complex. They spent their remaining years searching for lost children, trying to rebuild families torn apart by systematic breeding programs. Some succeeded in finding 1 or 2 children, most never found them all, a few never found any. Pauline remained in Ascension Parish working as a seamstress, maintaining contact with her 3 children who remained at Riverside. Marcus became a skilled carpenter. Her daughters Celine and Marie married and raised families. But the relationship between Pauline and her children was always complicated by their circumstances of conception and forced early separations. Pauline struggled with what we would now recognize as PTSD, nightmares about the examination room, intolerance of enclosed spaces, panic attacks triggered by medical settings, depression that sometimes made functioning difficult, and no access to mental health support to process decades of systematic trauma. This was the lasting impact that historical accounts often fail to capture. Physical liberation in 1865 didn't heal psychological wounds that would never fully close. The women carried trauma that manifested in nightmares, difficulty forming romantic relationships after years of systematic sexual exploitation, complicated relationships with children born under forced circumstances, mistrust of medical professionals, hypervigilance and anxiety until death, and they passed this trauma to children and grandchildren who grew up with mothers or grandmothers, sometimes waking screaming from nightmares about underground rooms, inheriting the psychological legacy of systematic dehumanization that didn't end with legal freedom. In 1873, Rachel died at age 55. Her death certificate listed consumption, the 19th century term for tuberculosis, but her granddaughter later testified that Rachel had simply worn out. Decades of forced pregnancies, inadequate nutrition, and psychological trauma had destroyed her body's ability to recover. At Rachel's funeral, 7 women who had survived Riverside's breeding program gathered to mourn, telling stories about Rachel's strength, intelligence, her role in maintaining the true accounting. They remembered her as someone who had refused to let the system completely destroy her humanity, and they made a pact. They would continue documenting, tell their stories to children and grandchildren, ensure what happened in those underground rooms would not be forgotten or sanitized by history. This pact became the foundation for testimony that would eventually emerge decades later. Meanwhile, Josephine continued living at Riverside, adapting to post-war Louisiana with the same practical efficiency she'd applied to managing her breeding program. She hired formerly enslaved people as paid laborers, paying wages so low they were barely better than enslavement, maintained her social position, donated to charity, and presented herself as a woman who had always been kind to her servants. She lived comfortably until 1889, dying at age 85. Her obituary in the Donaldsonville newspaper described her as a woman of remarkable intelligence and business acumen who managed one of the parish's most successful plantations for 6 decades. With no mention of the underground breeding complex, the women systematically exploited, the children sold. Josephine died wealthy, respected, and unpunished, never expressing remorse, never acknowledging her business acumen built on destroying human lives. Never facing earthly justice for 35 years of systematic sexual exploitation. 2 years after her death came the fire. On a hot July night in 1891, lightning struck Riverside's mansion. The building, dried by summer heat, burned with terrifying intensity. Firefighters from Donaldsonville focused on preventing spread to neighboring properties. That's when the 3rd floor collapse revealed the staircase. When firefighters descended and found the examination tables, leather restraints, and handwriting on walls documenting decades of systematic breeding, the fire marshal's report described unusual underground chambers at the former Blanchard estate in sanitized language suggesting medical facilities of unclear purpose. Local newspapers ran brief stories, but the full truth wasn't published. The white establishment in Ascension Parish had no interest in exposing what one of their most prominent families had done, but the black community knew. The elderly women who had survived Riverside's breeding program recognized descriptions in newspaper accounts, knew exactly what those rooms had been, and began talking more openly about what they'd endured. In 1897, a historian from Boston named Walter Garrison came to Louisiana to document experiences of formerly enslaved people, part of a new generation of scholars capturing first-hand testimony before all survivors died. He placed advertisements and met with community leaders, seeking people willing to tell their stories. 6 women who had survived Riverside's breeding program agreed to give recorded testimony, the first time their experiences were captured in their own words. Rather than filtered through clinical documentation or brief Freedmen's Bureau summaries, Pauline, 76 and living in Donaldsonville, gave testimony that provides devastating detail. "People ask me why we didn't resist more," she told Garrison. "They don't understand the choices we faced. It wasn't between freedom and captivity. It was between one kind of hell and another." Madame Blanchard made sure we knew resistance meant being sold to plantations where field workers died within a few years, where you'd never see your children, where conditions were even worse than the underground rooms. So we cooperated, we endured the examinations, we bore the children they forced on us, we participated in a system designed to break us, and we found ways to survive that I'm not sure anyone who hasn't experienced it can truly understand, but here's what I want people to know. We were more than what was done to us. Even in those rooms during the worst of it, we found ways to love each other, support each other, maintain some dignity and humanity. We sang, told stories, created community in spaces between forced pregnancies and examinations, and we documented everything. We knew Madame Blanchard was keeping records, so we kept our own. We memorized names, dates, sales prices. We preserved truth she wanted to hide, and after freedom, we wrote it all down so someday people would know what really happened. Not the sanitized version, not clinical documentation, but the human truth of what we endured and how we survived. Pauline's testimony, along with accounts from the other 5 women, provided the most comprehensive documentation of a plantation breeding program ever recorded. The testimonies described medical procedures, forced pairings, systematic separation of mothers and children, multi-generational exploitation, and resistance. The small rebellions' collective memory, ways they preserved humanity despite systematic attempts to reduce them to reproductive machinery. The strength required not just to survive, but to survive with enough psychological integrity to eventually tell their stories. Garrison's work was published in 1901 as Voices from Bondage, Testimony of Louisiana's Enslaved People. It received little attention at the time. The early 20th century was the nadir of race relations in America, with white supremacy reasserting itself through Jim Crow laws and racial violence. And stories about systematic sexual exploitation didn't fit the lost cause mythology becoming dominant in the South. But the testimonies existed, preserved in archives, waiting for a time when Americans would be willing to confront the full truth of what slavery had entailed. That time came slowly. Not until the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, did historians seriously investigate breeding programs on antebellum plantations. Researchers discovered that what happened at Riverside wasn't unique. At least 40 Louisiana plantations alone operated similar programs, extending to Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and other southern states. Conservative estimates suggest that between 1820 and 1865, at least 100 Zeros and enslaved women were subjected to systematic breeding programs across the South. Hundreds of thousands of children born under these circumstances. Millions of Americans today descended from people who survived these programs. The underground complex at Riverside was filled in during the 1890s when the property was sold. The new owners had no interest in preserving evidence. They leveled the mansion's ruins and converted the land to agricultural use. Today, the site shows no evidence of what occurred beneath its surface. But the evidence exists in other forms. Written testimony of survivors records Rachel and other women preserved. Genealogical research tracing families torn apart by systematic breeding. Stories passed down through generations of descendants who still carry the legacy. Charlotte's great-great-granddaughter, Evelyn Morris, spent 20 years researching her family history. She traced her lineage to Charlotte, documented the 7 children born in Riverside's underground complex, and tracked what became of them. 3 she located definitively. 2 she found probable matches for. 2 remained lost to history. In 2003, Evelyn published a family history including Charlotte's story, her ancestors' 32 years in the breeding program, children sold away, decades searching after liberation, and documented intergenerational trauma affecting Charlotte's descendants, depression, anxiety, difficulty forming healthy relationships persisting across generations. Understanding where we come from doesn't erase the trauma, Evelyn wrote, but it helps us make sense of patterns that otherwise seemed inexplicable. The strength it took for Charlotte to survive, the resilience passed down, the determination to document truth and preserve memory, that's what I inherited along with the trauma. This kind of genealogical research has become more common as descendants use DNA testing and archival records to trace family histories. Many discover ancestors born in plantation breeding programs. Family trees, including forced pairings documented in slaveholders' records, circumstances of their existence shaped by systematic sexual exploitation that their ancestors somehow survived. The last person born in Riverside's underground complex died in 1971. Her name was Sarah Mutton, born in 1863. Just 2 years before liberation, she spent her first 2 years underground, then was freed with her mother. Sarah spent her entire life searching for family members sold before the war, placing advertisements following leads, attending reunions hoping to reconnect. She never found her father, sold to Mississippi in 1862, or 2 older half-siblings her mother bore in the breeding program. In 1969, at age 106, Sarah gave one final interview to a graduate student researching Louisiana slavery. Nearly blind, memory fragmented, she remembered her mother's stories about the underground rooms, the examinations, forced pregnancies, community of women supporting each other. "My mama told me," Sarah said, That even in that basement, even when everything was designed to break them, the women found ways to be human, to be kind to each other, to love their children, even when they knew those children would be taken away. She said that was their resistance, that they refused to become the animals Madame Blanchard treated them as. And she told me to remember, to tell my children, to make sure the truth didn't die with her generation, because the people who did these things wanted it forgotten. They wanted to destroy the evidence and let it disappear into history. But we don't forget. We can't forget, not just because of what was done to our ancestors, but because of how they survived it. That strength, that refusal to be completely destroyed, that's what they passed down to us. Sarah died in 1971 at 108. With her death, the last living connection to Riverside's breeding program disappeared, but the story persists in archives, genealogical research, family histories, the collective memory of a community refusing to let these crimes be forgotten. The broader historical significance challenges common narratives about slavery. We're taught about slavery as a labor system, cotton, tobacco, sugar, economic relationships, political debates over expansion. We're taught less often that slavery was also a systematic program of sexual exploitation and reproductive control, that enslaved women's bodies were sites of violence beyond forced labor, that children were produced deliberately through calculated breeding programs, treating human reproduction as industrial manufacturing. This wasn't just individual sadistic slaveholders. It was a widespread business model plantation owners discussed openly and shared, corresponding about breeding techniques, trading enslaved men to diversify genetic stock, documenting programs with attention other businesses, gave inventory management, and it was legal. Everything Josephine did violated basic human dignity and modern standards of human rights, but violated no laws. Enslaved people had no legal right to bodily autonomy, no protection from sexual exploitation, no claim to their own children. The law treated them as property, and property rights trumped any consideration of humanity. Understanding this forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths about how systematic dehumanization functions, not just violence and brutality, though there was plenty, but bureaucratic organization of exploitation, careful documentation, scientific principles applied to human breeding, economic calculations treating births and deaths as profit and loss. The women who survived programs like Riverside's demonstrated forms of resistance history sometimes fails to recognize. They didn't lead dramatic slave rebellions or escape to freedom. Most couldn't, given captivity circumstances and threats to their children. Instead, they resisted by maintaining humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization, creating community, loving children despite knowing they'd be taken, documenting what was happening when captors tried to hide it, preserving memory when powerful people wanted to destroy evidence. When liberation came, they spent their remaining lives searching for lost children, rebuilding families, telling stories to anyone who would listen, ensuring that what happened would not disappear into sanitized historical narratives. Their descendants continue that work today, researching genealogies, preserving testimonies, ensuring breeding programs are understood not as footnotes but as central to understanding slavery as a system of sexual exploitation and reproductive control. What happened at Riverside and at dozens of similar facilities represents one of the darkest chapters in American history, not because it was uniquely evil, but because it reveals the logical endpoint of treating human beings as property. Once you accept that premise, everything else follows. Breeding programs, systematic sexual exploitation, destruction of families, reduction of reproduction to profit calculation. The women who survived deserved more than they received, justice that never came, compensation they never got, support for trauma that didn't exist, finding their children which most never did. What they got was freedom in the technical legal sense and the burden of surviving with trauma that would pursue them until death. They got to rebuild lives from nothing in a society still denying their full humanity. They got to pass stories down to descendants still grappling with systematic exploitation's legacy. But they also got to survive, to refuse complete destruction, to maintain enough strength to tell their stories, to preserve truth powerful people wanted hidden, to pass down resilience along with trauma. That survival, that insistence on being recognized as fully human despite systematic attempts to deny it, matters as much as the horror they endured. The history of places like Riverside isn't just about victimization, it's also about resistance, community, and the strength required not just to survive impossible circumstances, but to survive with enough integrity to bear witness. The sealed room beneath Josephine's mansion is gone, filled in and forgotten by the land above. But the stories survive. The testimony persists, the descendants remember. And the truth, preserved by women who refuse to let it die, remains available to anyone willing to confront it. This is what we owe to Charlotte, Rachel, Pauline, Marie, Sarah, and thousands of other women whose names we don't know. To remember not just what was done to them, but how they survived it. To acknowledge not just their suffering, but their strength. To preserve their testimony not as distant history, but as truth that still resonates. Because what happened in those rooms wasn't ancient history. The last survivor died within the lifetime of people still living. The descendants walk among us, carrying forward the legacy of strength and trauma their ancestors passed down. The evidence exists in archives, family stories, genealogical records. The question isn't whether this history exists, it's whether we're willing to face it honestly, to acknowledge the systematic sexual exploitation at slavery's core, to recognize multi-generational trauma still affecting descendants, to understand that freedom in 1865 didn't erase what had been done or heal what had been broken, and to honor the women who survived by telling their stories completely, not the sanitized version, not the comfortable narrative skipping the worst details, but the full truth of what they endured and how they maintained humanity despite systematic attempts to destroy it. That's what the sealed room exists for, to preserve stories history tried to bury, to give voice to people silenced, to ensure truth survives even when powerful forces try to destroy it. The women who survived Riverside's breeding program couldn't tell their stories publicly during their lifetimes. The society they lived in wasn't ready to hear testimony about systematic sexual exploitation and forced breeding, but they preserved their stories anyway, knowing someday someone would be ready to listen. That day is now. We have the testimony, the evidence, the descendants willing to share family histories. The question is whether we'll honor those women by actually confronting the truth they preserved at such great cost, because the sealed room exists. It exists in archives, testimonies, and family memories. It exists in genealogical research tracing bloodlines created by forced breeding. It exists in collective memory of a community that refuses to forget. And it exists in the stories we tell about American history, about what slavery actually meant, the systematic exploitation central to the system, the women who survived, and the strategies they used to maintain humanity in the face of dehumanization. Their stories demand remembering, not to create despair, but to recognize resilience, not to dwell on victimization, but to honor survival, not to forget the horror, but to ensure truth persists. The women who survived Riverside's underground breeding complex left us a gift. They documented what happened, preserved truth despite attempts to destroy it, survived with enough strength to eventually tell their stories, and passed down resilience along with trauma. The least we can do is listen, to really hear what they're telling us across the decades, to acknowledge the full truth of what they endured, to recognize the strength it took to survive, and to ensure their testimony becomes part of how we understand our history. What do you think about this hidden chapter of American history? How should we honor the women who survived systematic breeding programs? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved or challenged you, please like and share this video and subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be told, preserved, and remembered. These voices refuse to be silenced. Let's make sure they're finally heard.